They say there's been a royal palace at Westminster for nearly 1,000 years. Parliament has met here for the last 4 centuries. But in 1834, the building where it met went up in flames. There was a competition for a new design, and this was the winner. A great Gothic palace, its architects inspired by a vision of a medieval past. In the Second World War, Westminster was bombed. Once again, they decided to rebuild the House of Commons in the old style. That wasn't just an aesthetic choice. MPs wanted to keep the style of the old face-to-face debates, but besides that, they were looking to the past for another reason. The MPs of the 1940s, like the Victorians, meant the rebuilt House of Commons to tell a story, as many buildings do. It's a story the British used to be very fond of. Our rituals and ceremonies tell the same story. They say something about the past, they give it meaning, and so they impinge on the great state occasions and the historic buildings where they take place. They embody myths, shorthand history. Those myths help us to behave politically in certain ways.
What were the myths which inspired the West? What are the ideas which shaped the civilization of which we're a part? I can only give a personal view, but it seems to me that at the heart of Western civilization lie 2 visions. One is a vision of man himself and his nature. It sees him as capable of a real ultimate freedom of choice, able to run his own life and destiny, truly autonomous. And the other's a vision of history. It has meaning, direction. It's going somewhere. Now, of course, ideas like that were never held consciously by more than a minority of people across the centuries, but they affected the lives of millions. Always, the compass needle of Western civilization seems to swing back to them after flickering elsewhere for a while. And so, events take a certain course, and our history has taken a certain direction. The roots of those ideas lay a long way back. They lay back in ancient societies, ancient cultures, which were flourishing long before Western civilization was even born.
Somewhere back in almost unrecorded time lie the origins of the legends and folk memories of ancient Greece. Around their roots cluster mystery, superstition, fear, violence, dark forces which the Greeks never eliminated from their lives. Greek legends blend into Greek history, and that too was drenched in blood, punctuated by brutality, shot through with bitter competition. The Greeks went on consulting oracles and superstitiously buying charms and spells, and yet somehow their dark world of barbarism and demons distilled a unique sort of society, a miracle of civilization. 400 or 500 years before Christ, there were men in ancient Greece who respected the rational intellect and the power of human reason as they'd never been respected before. The ruins of an architecture which stressed order, balance, scale, regularity expressed that outlook. And so, in a different way, does Greek sculpture. It idealized the human body. But in the eyes of the Greeks, to be human was above all to be rational. They taught men to measure themselves against the gods, and that idea gave humanity itself a new status. That respect for reason shaped the future. Because of it, the Greeks founded our mathematics and our science, and they invented scientific history. The Greek world was clustered round the Aegean. It was a world of islands and little towns cradled by mountains and valleys. This island, Delos, was supposed to be the birthplace of Apollo. It was once a thriving community, a rich, busy port, and it was independent and autonomous, a Greek word. It was what the Greeks called a polis, a little city-state which was self-managing, self-directing. More of those who lived here or in cities like this took part in their political life than in any other part of the ancient world. And in some of them, that was a bigger proportion of the population than in many a modern democracy, another Greek word, incidentally. What's more, the citizens shared in the collective life of civic festivals, religion, the building of great public monuments, the whole artistic life which has left to us the first masterpieces of European theatre and art. But the Greeks were fiercely competitive. The prizes of political success might be great, but so was the price of failure, exile, or even death. And city-states competed fiercely with one another too. Only once did a great cause pull them together. In 490, there began the heroic struggle against Persia, which we remember still for the names of legendary exploits, Thermopylae, Marathon, Salamis, and some saw it even then as a struggle of civilizations, East and West. In that struggle, the Greeks could feel themselves children of Hellas, Hellenes. In spite of all their divisions, they had a common heritage, their language, their gods, an ideal of civilization and freedom which was distinct from the rest of mankind. Their opponents were, in their eyes, just barbarians. That sense of identity helped to make some Greek cities live, creative, as no others until then had ever been. In one city alone, Athens, there lived and worked within a span of a couple of 100 years Sophocles and Aristophanes among dramatists, Thucydides, the founder of scientific history, Phidias and Praxiteles among artists, and as philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, the man who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The list could go on and on, but that would still not be the whole story. What the Greeks left behind was much more than the list of things which happened to have come down to us. For one thing, that list is incomplete. We don't have a lot of the tragedies that were formed at the great civic festivals. We have only a few buildings, and those mostly in ruins or damaged. The whole achievement of Greek civilization was much greater than the sum of its parts. Perhaps that explains why people make their own choice of importances within it. For me, the important things were the Greek respect for reason and their belief in the possibility of the autonomy of the individual in his self-directed free life. Those were new ideas. They hadn't cropped up in the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Of course, in practice, they didn't always work out very well. But it's always a selection of the past and not the complete past that is, in fact, what shapes the future. And shape the future it did. Europeans for centuries were to look back to Greece and seek in it understanding of their own day, of their own circumstances, their own problems. The real Greek miracle is that they so often found that help that they needed. Perhaps it's not surprising. The Greeks really invented the idea of human excellence. They set up a standard of what men could do and might be in this life which has never been surpassed. That's why people still look back to them when they want to know what civilization really might be. And very soon there was a people who did indeed look consciously back to Greece for inspiration. A people who built an empire which in the end stretched from Scotland deep into Asia. Its cities sprawled along the African coast and all round the shores of the Mediterranean. They were the Romans. Living for a long time in central Italy, the Romans had been in contact with the Greeks at an early date, through cities in southern Italy and Sicily which had been founded by Greek immigrants. Those Greek colonies were conquered by the young Roman Republic. And then the Romans went on, first to overcome Greece itself, and then the world of Greek civilization beyond that, in Syria, in Egypt, the world built from the campaigns of Alexander the Great, early in the 3rd century BC. This was the Hellenistic world, a world of great cities where men spoke and wrote Greek, lived in the Greek style, and saw themselves as heirs to the Greek past. The conquering Romans came from a different background. The more they saw of Greek civilization, the more provincial some of them came to feel. That drove them to think more about their own cultural identity, who they really were. They were fascinated by this new world. And so they took up the Greek gods, taught their children Greek language and literature, and the Romans were, so to speak, brainwashed. In the end, the Roman ruling class came to see itself as the heirs of the Greeks. They built their cities on Greek lines, with baths, theatres, forums. And at Rome itself, they built imitation Greek temples that can still be seen. One Roman poet summed it up in a famous epigram. "Conquered Greece," he said, "took captive her own fierce conqueror." So the Roman Empire came to be the transmission system of the Greek achievement, as well as its protecting shield. The man usually reckoned to be the founder of the empire was Augustus. He was ruling at the time when Jesus Christ was born, but almost certainly he'd never heard of him. In Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, he's called Octavian. But Augustus was his best-known title. It meant exalted or sacred. Augustus himself never claimed to be more than first citizen of the Republic. But he brought peace after troubled times and founded a dynasty which would rule the Roman Empire for its next 4 generations. If I were to stop this car and ask a passer-by what ancient Rome really meant to him, there's a fair chance he'd say ruins. They literally dominate our view of the empire. There they are all over North Africa, the Middle East, Western Europe, the Balkans, and of course in the imperial city itself. It's no wonder that when people came to look back at those ruins in the Middle Ages, they thought they were so extraordinary that they must have been done by superhuman power. They said they must have been done by giants or magicians. Take the road system, for example. Take this road, the Via Appia, the Appian Way, the great consular road that led out of Rome to the south to the southern ports of Brindisi and Taranto. Along it, the great Roman families built their tombs. It was a road which they began building 250 years before Christ. Julius Caesar put his own money into repairing it. There are still some Roman bumps in it. And it was the road on which, said, St. Peter met a vision of Christ himself. And yet, that was only one of a whole system of roads, linking the whole empire together in a great web, so that a legion could march from Newcastle on Tyne to Jordan. All roads led to Rome because it was a center of government. Center, in fact, of the greatest system of power, law and order there had ever been. It It was that government, that organization, that order, which lay behind those amazing monuments. It was a vast achievement. It was not government as we know it. There wasn't the machinery for that. But the Romans could collect their taxes, and they could keep order, and do it among many different peoples. Imperial government was a very impressive thing. On the other hand, even provincial officials had to deal with their problems as best they could without much help from the center. Pontius Pilate, for example, far away in Jerusalem, had to make up his own mind to wash his hands of a difficult case. The other great ancient influence in the shaping of our civilization is that of the Jews. Nowadays, it's too easy to think of them only in the context of the modern state of Israel, but we have to try to see what Judaism and Jewishness meant nearly 2,000 years ago. Then the Jews were just one among subject peoples of the Romans, and they were scattered throughout the empire. Basically, the Romans respected their subjects' widely different customs and beliefs, so long as they kept the law. So, Jews had a measure of self-government, they could worship as they pleased, and follow all the special customs which marked them out, notably circumcision and special dietary rules. The center of their cult was here, Jerusalem, once the site of Solomon's Temple, the Holy City. The Jews' customs and rituals made them exclusive. So did their belief that they, the children of Israel, were a chosen people destined for salvation. Only a few non-Jews, attracted by the promise of salvation, were willing to accept Jewish practices. That promise was contained in the word of the Lord spoken through the law and the prophets. The scrolls that bear that word are still at the heart of the practice of the synagogue. Some of the holy writings of the Jews were translated into Greek at an early date, so non-Jews could learn from them. Judaism was a religion of the book, a book which was to pass on to Christianity as the Old Testament. Nowadays, Jews from all over the world, the Yemen, Morocco, the USA, come to Jerusalem not just to parade the scrolls in the religious festivals like this one, but on political and sentimental pilgrimages. The Holy City is now a political focus for world Jewry. But nearly 2,000 years ago, it was a place where a few Palestinian Jews changed the course of history. They were simple, seemingly unremarkable men, but unwittingly they launched a new world religion. They believed they had met and known as a teacher the Messiah, the King of the Jews. They believed too that they had seen him crucified, dead and buried, but that he had risen from the dead, ascended into heaven, and still lived there in glory everlasting with his Father, Yahweh, the Jewish God. What is more, they believed that they too, if they followed his teaching, would overcome death. Millions of men were to come to share those beliefs. They were to generate enormous moral power, elaborate theology, and yet those beliefs that certain things had happened seemed to me the heart of Christianity. Without them, it could never have become a great historic religion. Those ideas cannot be understood apart from the Jewish tradition. the tradition cradled in the desert through which Moses had led his people centuries before on their long march to the Promised Land. One great idea came out of the desert, which was to be absolutely fundamental to both the Jewish and the Christian traditions, the idea of monotheism, that there is one God, the creator and judge of all men. It's an idea with enormous ramifications. It affects your view of morals, metaphysics, even the physical universe, and much else besides. But I think there are two others we might be in danger of overlooking. Both ideas we owe to the Jews. One, I can't find a better name for than the idea of the bad conscience. Some cultures have never had it, but you can see it in the writings of the prophets of the Old Testament, and after that, time and time again, it comes back in Western thought as a kind of goad, promoting that same nagging sense of inadequacy which was also promoted by the Greeks' sense of the search for excellence through self-criticism. It was always at work to expand the boundaries, the morally possible. Then there's the other great Jewish idea, the idea of the chosen people. Many times in later generations, Christians were to jump on that metaphor. They felt chosen too. They felt themselves to be making their way through a vale of tears towards a promised land under the protection of a greater power. And that's why that sense of going somewhere, of being on pilgrimage, of following the pillar of fire in the wilderness wherever it led, never quite left Christian society. It crops up in many forms in those medieval men who sought sanctity through poverty and suffering, in the Pilgrim Fathers and those like them who crossed oceans to found communities of righteousness in a new world, even in later people, in secular utopians who offered men salvation through suffering. And it always tended to mean that Western history could be seen as having meaning. It wasn't just a succession of events. It was progressive. It was a history that was going somewhere. Yet Christianity came into a world full of people who felt lost, without direction. It was a world looking for saviors, and that was shown by the swarm of queer cults and mystery religions which spread from the east through the Mediterranean, cults like those of Artemis, Isis, Mithras. In the credulous and tolerant Roman world, they found a big public, happy to listen to magicians, charlatans, prophets. A public often uncertain, uneasy, desperate for reassurance. No doubt many people then saw Christianity too as just one more cult peddled by the followers of an Oriental holy man as it spread through the Jewish communities in the great Mediterranean seaports. But it soon began to look further, beyond the closed world of the Jews in which it had been born. Somewhere about the year AD 49, in Jerusalem, what is now seen as the First Council of the Church launched the process of spreading the Christian message more widely. A Hellenized Jew, St. Paul, was sent out to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish peoples, without demanding that they accept circumcision and the law of Moses. That was the beginning of the first great missionary age of Christianity. From this time, Christianity gradually grew in the shade of Greco-Roman civilization. Later, Christians were to look back and see the Roman Empire as providentially ordained to be the cradle and the nursery of their faith. Of course, the old pagan temples stayed in business. Christianity sometimes attached itself to them almost literally, as the ruins of Christian churches alongside pagan temples still show. But like mistletoe and the apple tree, Christianity was a parasite on a host seemingly untroubled by it. It won converts even at Rome, the imperial capital itself. People used to think that the famous catacombs of Rome were refuges where the early Christians hid from persecution. But for most of the time, the emperors left the Christians alone. The catacombs weren't hiding places, they were cemeteries. What they mark is a story of success, the rapid growth of the Christian community at Rome, for they run for miles, 60 or 70 feet underground, with thousands of burial places. The early Christians buried their dead in the sure belief of their early resurrection. Christianity's greatest appeal of all was its promise to overcome death. That drew converts from all sides, Greek and Jew, man and woman, slave and freeman. And as it did so, other, more philosophical ideas were bound to begin to influence the new religion, especially in the great cities, even here in Rome. Above all from Greek sources, new light was beginning to break in. Slowly, links were forged between Christianity and the society in which it was making its way. More and more, Christian belief began to be distinct from its Jewish roots. The Jewish background was never lost to sight, though. The catacombs are full of reminders of it. The Eucharist, or Holy Communion, the central Christian sacrament, is evoked by pictures of the Last Supper, which Jesus took with his disciples, long believed to have been the Jewish Passover meal. Tucked away in dark corners are paintings of Old Testament stories, Jonah and the whale, for instance. So Christianity grew, and in the end, it was to take over the empire itself. The conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity was momentous. It was to determine the future of a whole civilization. The crucial decision was taken by a Serbian soldier, Constantine, later called the Great, and sometimes the 13th Apostle. In the year 306, at York, he was chosen as emperor by the army. It took him 20 years to deal with his rivals and get a real grip on the empire. Long before that, though, he became a Christian. Why did he take up the new faith? We don't exactly know. We do know that in the year 312, before a battle, he had a vision in a dream which led him to order his soldiers to put a Christian sign on their shields for the next day. He was going to give the Christian God a try. It seemed to work. He won. After that, he began to favor and protect Christians, endowing their churches and clergy. After a few years, the pagan sign of the sun god disappeared from his coins. A Christian monogram replaced it. Finally, 12 years after the battle, he declared himself a Christian. Constantine made another decision, too, which was to shape world history. He decided to build a new capital city in the east, a Christian city, unpolluted by pagan rites and temples, and he called it Constantinople. Today, its name recalls its long history as an Islamic city, Istanbul. There were good reasons to build a new capital in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Constantine's empire was already too big to be run from Rome as a single unit. Diocletian, an earlier emperor, had already divided responsibility for it with a co-emperor, one ruling the east, one the west. Constantine chose an ancient site. An old Greek city, Byzantium, had stood there, on the shores of the Bosphorus.
Once you're out in a boat, it's easy to see why this was such a marvelous site for an imperial capital. Strategically, it speaks for itself. Over there is Asia, and here, just the other side, is Europe. The space between is so narrow there's a bridge across now. But before the bridge was there, you could row across if you wanted to spend the effort on it. In the west, all the Roman roads led to Rome, but here in the east, they led to this gap between two continents. Up there was the old city, looking down on an inlet with a magical name, the Golden Horn, famous through history not only as the moat to the city on this side, but also as a haven for great fleets of warships and merchantmen. Behind that moat and behind the walls girdling it on the other side, the capital was safe and secure for centuries. It wasn't until nearly 900 years had passed that a hostile army entered it at last. And during that time, of course, something else could happen. Constantinople became more than a capital, it became the focus of a civilization. Byzantium, the old Greek city which had been here centuries before, had been right at the middle of the ancient Greek world. Troy is just down there. And that meant that when the empire drifted apart into two administrative halves, a gap also opened up between cultures. Constantinople, that became the center of the Greek East, Rome of the Latin West.
Nowadays, there's not much left of Constantine's great capital. Centuries of later history have left other monuments. Sadly, much of the Roman city has been obliterated. Houses have grown up in the gaps of the Roman walls. Thanks to Constantine's decision, this was to be a crossroads of history right down to our own century. Nevertheless, Constantine's deepest mark on history was made by his conversion. Because he accepted Christianity, the church would be the legatee of the Roman Empire. In the stormy centuries ahead, it would be linked to the imperial glamour and prestige of a mighty past, and that link was to prove indissoluble. Church and empire became partners, and the church was to use the advantage that gave it. The church ruthlessly used the power it got from the imperial patronage. People sensed the way the tide was running, where influence lay. As time went by, they turned towards Christianity in growing numbers. More Christian churches were built, modeled on pagan temples or Roman law courts. The stamp of the cross was put on old buildings converted, like their users, to the service of a Christian god. Here in Ephesus, at the old cult center of the goddess Diana, statues of the evangelists were added to those of the emperors who lined the harbor road. It now seems odd that the Christians should themselves so often have felt not confident about the future, but frightened and uneasy. They often thought of themselves in an image drawn from their Jewish past as a saving remnant, chosen to survive the tempests, riding out over the tribulations and mischances of this life in the Noah's Ark which the church provided. And fear made them harsh and intransigent. After all, they still believed in demons and magic. They moved in a world where, they thought, heresy or paganism might consign men to eternal torture in hellfire. That, they thought, justified their cruelty to their rivals. Early Christians must often have seemed to the educated Roman to have been very unpleasant and uncivilized. Yet some of them were heroic, and they changed the history of the world. When at the end of the 5th century a Christian emperor expelled the last pagan teachers from Athens, the ancient world of the Greeks and Romans was, intellectually speaking, ended. The church was in the saddle and was to show itself master. What it did with Constantine's legacy ensured that the future history of Europe would be the story of a Christian civilization which looked back to Christ, a Jew born in Bethlehem, as its head. Those Christian ideas which were cradled and sheltered by the Roman Empire and which were eventually to take it over were not just philosophical crutches which helped men and women to understand the world or think they understood it. They were also going to lead and drive men to action to change it. They were among the greatest revolutionary forces in the whole of history. For a long time, though, it can hardly have seemed much like that. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire was crumbling in the West. Barbarian kingdoms were replacing the old provinces. The imperial city itself had been sacked. If Rome can perish, said one Christian, what can survive? And many Christians agreed with him. And they tended to turn their backs on the world, retire somewhat into private life, and to concentrate on preparing their souls for the judgment to come and the eternity which would follow. And yet, even at that moment, the church itself, almost unknown, was becoming the vehicle by which so much of the classical past would be transmitted to the future. That would bring vast changes. It would create a civilization quite unlike any other, active, striving, and above all, self-critical. A civilization that changed the world. Take, for instance, the Christian view of the individual, of man or woman as a creature of immense worth, infinite value, and possessed too of autonomy, the power of self-direction with responsibility to choose in their own lives good or evil. Those are ideas which still have, round the world today, immense power to get in the way of closed societies and authoritarian regimes. And sometimes ideas from that past pop up in unexpected or paradoxical places. It was about 1800 years after Christ and more than 2,000 after Socrates that a German said that the purpose of philosophers was not to understand the world, but to change it. His name was Karl Marx. Marx, in my book, is a quintessentially Western figure. He was a middle-class Rhinelander, born to a Christianized Jewish family in 1818, educated in the classics and in law and in Hegelian philosophy. His ideas are indelibly marked by their Greek and Jewish roots. Whole libraries have been written about what Marx said. His own writings run to many volumes. But however deep you burrow, I think you always find at the center of his thought two great themes. One is that men are capable of freedom. They are in principle autonomous, even if in the world as it is and as we know it, freedom is for most people still an illusion. Marx thinks that the sheer weight of material and historical circumstances is too great for most men to realize their capacities, to make of their own lives what they will. He thinks those hindrances will have to be removed before men can assume the control over their destiny which he believes they ought to enjoy. The second theme is that history is on the side of freedom. It's going somewhere. Inexorably and inevitably, though Marx is rather obscure about exactly how, it's moving, he says, towards the liberation of mankind, a liberation independent of human will, but if men join the march, says Marx, they can identify themselves with history. And so, they may escape from the kingdom of necessity. In effect, Marx believes in God, but he prefers to call him history. In some countries, those ideas are proclaimed to have triumphed. If they have, it is as a faith, as a religion, as a power moving men, and not, as Marx hoped, as a scientific system. Like a mighty army moves the Church of Marx. For it is as a church that it has changed the world, and changed it, not, perhaps, always as Marx would have hoped.
Marx started to think about society and history when he was a student, and he went on as a radical journalist and finished up in self-imposed exile here, I suppose, in the reading room of the British Museum, now called the British Library. Here he could find the statistics, the blue books, the reports that he needed. But at the bottom of his thought, there was something more than political economy, something more even than the bottomless profundities of Hegel. There was passion. When Marx denounces a society which is cruel, hypocritical towards those it used, he sounds like an Old Testament prophet. He nags away at our complacency for ignoring the human costs of material success. What's more, he thinks retribution will come. The expropriators will be expropriated. One day, the proletariat will march into the promised land, the land of freedom, when individuals will rule their lives by the light of their own reason, self-directed, autonomous beings. The myths of Marxism, in fact, turn out to be rather like those of Christianity in being striving, active, self-critical. And no more than the myths of Christianity can they be argued away simply by pointing to the fact that hundreds of times they've been hideously perverted, abused, and distorted. The ideas of Karl Marx are some of the most remarkable instances of the endurance and strength of ideas, assumptions, themes, myths, if you like, that lie at the very roots of our civilization. They go back into antiquity, however changed their forms, but they are strongly at work today. How that happened, how they came to us through Christianity, that's another story. But think of just one of the many paradoxes it produces. For tens of years, black, brown, yellow men in Asia and Africa struggled to throw off what they saw as the shackles of imperialism. And as they did so, they often appealed to the principles of Marxist thought, and they flourished the name of Marx himself like a talisman. Doing that, using that language, was itself a testimony to the debt they were in, to the culture they were trying to resist. It makes one think of the old Roman poet again, and his line about captive Greece taking captive her fierce conqueror.